Hi folks, Florida Man here. Today it pleases me to bring you a video on how to get a house game organized. I'll briefly address various aspects of the challenges of doing that. Having attended some house games in the past and having thought about hosting, although I've never actually done so, this is something I've given a good deal of thought to. Before I go further, I want to give credit to Victory First, who's the one who gave me the idea to make a video like this. It was about a year ago now, but I do get around to things eventually, most of the time. Now on to what you need to run a house game. The first thing to make sure you have is the equipment to play a house game. Many of the people I know in the diplomacy hobby play primarily or exclusively online, but for the real feel of a house game, it's best to have a physical board. Even if you're going to have a website do adjudication of orders, having a physical board gives players something more tangible to look at and contemplate when thinking about their next sequence of moves. Fortunately, most of the people watching this video probably have a physical board. Next, consider whether you actually have the infrastructure physically to hold a house game. You need a house, or something very similar to a house, to have a house game. If you have a tent, you can't have a house game. If you live in a studio apartment, you probably can't have a house game unless you're willing to get creative and have people negotiating around the block, and other people negotiating in the laundry room, and over by the trash cans, and in the stairwell. That is doable if you and the people playing in your game are willing to make that happen, if you don't mind having 6 sweaty players, probably mostly male, hanging out in the single room that you sleep and eat in. When Victory First proposed this video topic, he wondered specifically how to hold negotiations without people eavesdropping on you. I have a few thoughts on that. You can rely on an honor system, which you could explain to other people before the game, but I don't think that's necessarily in keeping with the spirit of the game. Underhanded maneuvers are not necessarily unethical in diplomacy, so whether you can make this an honor thing depends on who you're playing with and your shared sense of what's right and wrong in diplomacy. The simplest tip to keep from being overheard is the most primitive tip, of course. Just whisper. If you keep your voices down, you will probably not be overheard unless someone is actually wiretapping your conversations. And if that's happening at your house game, at your house, you have a whole other kind of problem to worry about beyond the problem of losing at a board game. The more likely issue you'll have is that it's difficult to negotiate with someone without someone seeing you walk off with them, and that could very well give away who you're working with. However, that's not really a bug when it comes to in-person diplomacy. It's a feature. The physicality of playing face-to-face diplomacy is a separate detail to master, and I won't go into it too much here. I'll just note that one tactic in face-to-face diplomacy is to observe who's walking around and talking with who, and another tactic is to control who can speak with who. President Lyndon Johnson was famous for doing this. He'd sort of get into a domineering pose, corner people, sometimes physically grab them, give them a really rough handshake, and with his physicality and his body language, he'd keep the other person from leaving or feeling able to leave until he twisted their arm and got them to agree to do what he wanted. This is an extremely common tactic in face-to-face diplomacy where the time limits are a critical part of how the seasons aspect works. Hopefully people in your house game will not be as aggressive as Lyndon Johnson. But going back to what Victory First was wondering about, the truth is that the only tip to actually make snooping on your own negotiations difficult is you just need to have lots of different spaces people can go to negotiate in, and make sure they're as spread out as you can. That's not much of a tip because that depends entirely on where you live, which I assume you're not going to change just for the purpose of a house game. Assess your own situation, your own floor plan, which spaces you have available to negotiate in at home. You can designate various rooms as being good for negotiations if that's something you feel is necessary, or you can let people figure it out for themselves. If you aren't careful, that may result in people holding up in the bathrooms at certain points though. If you have multiple rooms, and an upstairs, and a backyard, and a front yard, and a basement, you obviously have an advantage here, because people will be able to scatter so effectively that they might not even be able to find each other when they're not hiding, let alone when they're conducting confidential negotiations. For the record, I am not currently a house owner myself. I am a house renter, and this is part of the challenge of hosting a house game of diplomacy. If you don't own your own home, your neighbor or landlord or other tenants might have an issue with you and your guests fanning out to different parts of the house and the yard. There might be complaints, and if the behavior is repeated and the complaints continue, there might be evictions. That might not be as much of a problem in certain places, but it really depends on your situation. I certainly do not endorse getting evicted just so you can be the cool guy in your friend group who hosts diplomacy games. The next step is the most challenging of them all, in my opinion. You need players. This is the step at which most house games will falter, because the ideal is there will be a total of 7 people there. Just you and 6 of your closest friends, all standing around a diplomacy board. And you do need to invite at least 6, and make sure at least that many are coming. It's okay to have more end up showing up, because they can start playing a card game, or a different board game, or act as advisors or something, or you can play a variant game that requires more than 7 players. If you have fewer than 7 players, you start having to figure out how you're going to play a shorthanded game of diplomacy, and that's a bad position to be in. You can play a 6-player game without losing the whole spirit of diplomacy. You just play on the classic map, but you don't assign anyone to play Italy. That does create a small imbalance in the game, but it's less of an imbalance than it would be if you were missing any other country. The Italian units just hold in one place, and that ends up being surprisingly similar in impact to just having a normal game. It's once you're down to 5 players that you start to have serious problems. Eliminating a second player means you either have to play a very unbalanced version of the classic map, which I do not recommend, or you have to assign a couple of people to play 2 countries each. That can work, but it requires a lot of work on the part of the 2 players who are doing double duty. The other alternative is you play a variant map with only 5 or fewer countries. I do find those variants inherently less interesting than the 6 or 7 or more countries variants, but if you have to do that, you have to do that. If you know your number of players is going to be something other than 7, I recommend you agree on a variant map beforehand. I think it would also be very nice to have a big printed out map of the variant you're playing, maybe even laminate it or something. It would add an air of additional legitimacy to the game, by sort of imitating the size and look of a real board game map. If you only have a total of 2 players, including yourself, I recommend just setting up a couple of laptops and playing the 2-player challenge on Play Diplomacy. When you do that, you each get a country, or sometimes 2 or 3 countries, and you just try to take over the world. It's basically turning the diplomacy map into a chessboard and racing to 18 centers. You fight until one country reaches 18. The powers that don't have players just hold in place, or they don't have any armies at all. This is frankly so much less interesting than a normal game of diplomacy that you might consider playing some other game like chess that's really designed for 2 players, because if you only have 2 players, there is no diplomatic aspect to the game. There is no benefit to negotiating for either side. You'll just both lie and betray agreements, or you'll be trying to trick the other person into making bad agreements or bad moves. And that's not really likely to be successful, because you'd have to be much smarter than the other person, or much better at the 2-player version of the game, to actually have any advantage doing that. So fundamentally, you really do need the 7 players, or at least 5, bare minimum. Back when I started playing house games, when my channel was new, and even before it started, I found games through Meetup playing with the Potomac Tea and Knife Society. I recommend looking on Meetup for a group that plays near you. There probably won't be one unless you live in one of a few specific regions, like near the Potomac or in Chicago. However, if you're energetic and determined, you can be the person who organizes such a community. Create your own Meetup page for your region, or a Facebook group, or both. One of these days, I'll probably do that for the area where I live. If you aren't able to use Meetup or social media generally to get people to come to your house and play, you may have to go out and hunt yourself some players. You might have to tranquilize them, throw them in your trunk, and drive them to the game location. Getting to 7 players might get rough. The downsides of this are obvious. You have to capture, bind, and gag people, overpowering them is a pain, and you have no reason to believe they won't call the police when they're supposed to be negotiating. There's every possibility you wind up in a hostage situation if you're not careful. Assuming you don't end up in a confrontation with the police, you have to knock them out again to take them back where you found them after the game is over. And then conducting the game is extra difficult. You have to drag players into other rooms in order to let them negotiate, unless you're willing to untie them, which you shouldn't do because you're basically taking your life into your hands if you do that, since you sort of kind of kidnapped them, and they might go for a kitchen knife when your back is turned. And you have to either have very good soundproofing or a house in the middle of nowhere, because once you pull the tape off someone's mouth, they might start screaming instead of negotiating. This is all not even mentioning the fact that if you start randomly abducting people, unless you kidnap them from outside a diplomacy tournament, they probably won't even know the rules. Bunch of noobs. Then you'll have to explain them. Big waste of time. Bottom line, in addition to being against the law, this method is more trouble than it's worth. I do not recommend. Anyway, once you have your hostages, I mean your players, I said players. Once you have your players lined up, the only thing you really have to worry about is how you guys are going to stay in one place for the 6 to 8 hours that you should probably have clear for this house game. And yes, I do recommend planning for that long. Things do come up, and that is a long time commitment that might be hard for you to actually set aside, but if you have fewer than a bare minimum of 4 to 5 hours, there's really not much point in actually doing this. At 30 minutes for the first season and 15 minutes for every subsequent season, plus 5 minutes or so for retreats and builds sprinkled throughout, you can see how you would not get very far into a game that only lasted 2 or 3 hours, and it would not be very satisfying for anyone. If you're going to host people for 6 to 8 hours in your home, the key thing is to be well stocked on toilet paper and snacks. I recommend taking the opinion of your group on whether everyone would like to go in on a pizza together, or a platter of sandwiches or something. At the very least, I'd say you should put out chips and other snacks along with some drinks and ice. That will give the game an atmosphere of more of an event, and help people settle in for the long haul. If you resolve the hunger crisis, and you resolve the challenge of getting people there for the game, you're pretty much 90% of the way to having a great time. You and your 6 friends should pat yourselves on the back, after you leap into the air and take a selfie in mid-jump. There's no such thing as expressing too much excitement about this accomplishment. I wish you the best, and I hope you have a great time. If it goes well, you can thank me for my modest support by getting your friends to watch my videos, like and subscribe to my channel, and maybe join the people whose names now appear on screen by providing further support. There can never be too many subscribers, too many patrons, or too many translators for Florida Man Diplomacy until our message has reached every corner of the earth. Thank you for watching this Florida Man Diplomacy production. Until next time, Florida Man out.